get started. Test is Monday, chapters 2 and 3, the chapter on India and the chapter on China. Okay. A few things I want to pick up from the chapter on on India. A few terms. Word Raha, Maharaha, Great One, Very Great One. I might have mentioned those last class. Now, let's see. All right. China. China was largely isolated from the rest of the world, except for it had contact with the Mongolians, people to the north, mostly barbaric people to the north, and with Japan just across the sea, and there was Korea, and there was Vietnam, of which China was referred to as the Middle Kingdom. Now, before I start with the Chinese, there's something I want to say about them. They were, except for perhaps the Sumerians, up until the year 1500, they were the most creative, inventive people on the face of the earth. I once saw a list of their inventions, and I'm sure I couldn't even start to begin to name them all. They invented gunpowder, invented the banking system, paper money, and you may not realize how valuable banks and paper money are, but without paper money you cannot have a complex economy. They invented a wheelbarrow, which you'll find in almost every American home and on every construction site. They learned how to rotate crops to where you'd put minerals back in the soil but letting land lie fallow for at least a year. The word fallow means that you don't plant land in the hopes of getting the minerals and nutrients back into the soil. Let's see, they invented silk, porcelain, steel, learned how to mix iron with other metals to make steel, most notoriously magnesium, most notably magnesium. All these things that they invented the rudder to control the movement of a boat and the movable sail. Very important. Any of you know anything about sailboating know that you can catch the wind best if you can move the sails in such a way that they'll catch the wind. You move the sails. And it's even possible to sail against the wind if the wind is blowing this way and you want to go this way. Any of you know how you do it? You zigzag. First move the boat this way and move the sail this way to catch the wind, like this. Then you move the boat this way. And again, move the sail in such a way as to catch the wind, like so. Actually, probably do it more like this. Yeah, more like this. But you zig and you zag. And you can zig and zag against the wind. Again, one of the most important inventions was the printing press. That's the one I was trying to think of. The printing press. without the printing press, you have to print each letter by hand, and folk, you wouldn't have these textbooks we have today if it were not for the invention of the printing press. So these were inventive, creative people, and a people whose inventions should have enabled them to conquer the whole world, enabled them to overspread the whole globe, and bring mankind back together again. Well, they simply didn't. There's been all kinds of books written as the reasons why they were not the ones who overspread the globe and brought mankind together, but nevertheless, they didn't. We'll get into more about possible reasons why later. Now, the beginning of their history, it's said to have begun with the advent of three sovereigns. There was three kings. I believe I misspelled that word. Anyway, three kings who ruled one after the other, and these three kings gave them the gifts of civilization, taught them how to plant, plow, fertilize their gardens, and taught them civil government, how to respect and honor their kings, their civil rulers. And these three sovereigns supposedly ruled one after the other. Now, at the moment, historians do not consider these three sovereigns to be serious history. And like every other group of people, the Chinese begin their history with stories that we would call mythological or, in fact, fairy tales. Stories that we today have a hard time believing. Chinese are no exceptions. Well, the three sovereigns gave them their civilization. Then came the Xia dynasty, otherwise spelled Xia, pronounced Xia, the Xia dynasty, or HSIA. Okay, first of all, folks, about Chinese history, it's divided up according to dynasties, similar to the Egyptian. The difference between the Chinese and the Egyptian, the Chinese named their dynasties. The Egyptians simply called them first dynasty, second dynasty, and so on, third dynasty, fourth dynasty. The Chinese named theirs. In fact, there's a lot about Chinese history that is similar to Egyptian history, and there might be a good reason for that. In that, if you refer back to this genome map that I showed you the first class, tracing the journey of our ancestors, it shows that the Chinese people possibly or likely came from Egypt and spread from Egypt across southern Asia, then went into China. Now, we also have learned that a bunch of Indo-European peoples, Caucasian peoples that is, also found their way into China. Anyway, the Chinese are a mixture of probably Northwest African or Egyptian peoples and Caucasian peoples. Now, the idea that the Caucasian peoples found their way all the way to China, folks, this is something fairly new, something that's only been said in the last 30 or so years. Before that, we had no idea that Caucasians ever entered China, particularly ancient China. Anyway, eventually, okay, the Xia dynasty, like the three sovereigns, is not considered serious history by modern historians. Eventually, the Shang dynasty came on the scene, and they are considered like the first true historical dynasty. One reason they're considered historical is we have found the palace, we've found writings that are dated contemporary, found grave sites, so they are in some of the tombs of the emperors, so they're considered genuine, true history. Anyway, now, like other civilizations, the Chinese settled on the banks of rivers. Their two main rivers were the Yangtze and the Yellow. Weirdly enough, we have a river right here in Georgia nearby called the Yellow River, just a few miles away, even though our Yellow River is nothing to compare with the Chinese Yellow River. All right. The Chinese also, early in their history, built, they had trouble with the barbaric Mongolians to the north, so to keep the Mongolians from coming in and stealing their stuff, they built a Great Wall. The Great Wall still stands, and your book will tell you which dynasty started the Great Wall and which dynasty finished it. The Great Wall we have today was actually built over a period of several generations. It would be built, then as it started to crumble, it would be repaired. Also, the construction of it is very uneven. Some of it was very well built with a very high quality concrete. Others was built with a very sandy, shoddy type of concrete that has crumbled down through the years. The Great Wall was put up to discourage barbarians from coming in and stealing their stuff. And these barbarians would come into a small, unsuspecting town and not just steal their stuff, but steal children and women, wives, and whatever, and carry them off. Now, a few years back, when I was teaching another school, I had a student write a paper on that the Chinese, instead of spending all these resources building the Great Wall, should have simply raised up a trained army. What I think he was guilty of doing was simply forgetting that in those days there were no radios, there were no helicopters, there were no airplanes, no reconnaissance missions. So no matter how well the Chinese would have trained their army, the barbarians would have figured out where the army was not and then strike at some place where the army was not, and the army could simply not be everywhere at once. With the Great Wall, they could have post a few sentries at various places along the wall, and then if the enemy invaded, a few people could send a message to everybody else, hey, come and help us, we're being invaded here. So the wall really was the most practical solution. In Great Britain, a ruler named Hadrian also built a wall, had what's called Hadrian's Wall. And again, part of it still stands. All right. The Chinese early learned that they needed a lot of workers on their farms. So their primary occupation was farming, as was the case of all these ancient peoples. But their main crop was rice. And this was to remain true for millennia, not just centuries, but for millennia. Now, if you know anything at all about rice growing, and we have tried some rice growing in South Georgia and South Carolina, a few places in the southeast, it requires a whole lot of effort, and generally the effort of a community. So because of this, the Chinese looked on their families as being extended family. Everybody who was descended from the same great grandfather was considered part of your family. So your family went back a few generations. Your first cousins, second cousins, the third cousins would all be part of your family if you were descended from the same great-great-grandparents. Then, and basically what we would call families, I mean what they called families, we would call clans. And a lot of this still exists in China. Clans, what we call clans, make up the family because the Chinese still grow rice. And something else about Chinese farming. Rice growing simply cannot be done with tractors, combines, reapers. In other words, this modern day farm machinery that we have here in the United States that does so well with planting our wheat and corn and oats and barley and rye and soybeans and whatever, just simply will not work with rice farming. So rice farming, for the most part, is done the same way it was done 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And the Chinese have a difficult time feeding the population. All it takes is a small little bit of famine and a lot of people starve. And the last big starvation occurred in the 1950s when communism first took over, when I was younger than you are. Again, it took a cooperating extended family to grow rice. The Chinese writing, now if you think it looks like Egyptian writing, I think so too, a lot, except the Egyptian writing was called hieroglyphics. Chinese writing is ideographical. In other words, they're using symbols that look like pictures, pictographic ideas that make up their writing. There are thousands upon thousands of symbols to learn, and it's therefore the learning is a little bit, I mean, the language is a little bit difficult to learn because they don't use the alphabet like we do. I read not too long ago where the man who decided to use a computer to type out your language invented a program where he hit a few computer keys in English. I mean, they have to use the same computer keyboard we do, but it would type a Chinese character. Then hit another few keys and type a Chinese character. And this became the industry standard for Chinese. And you can use, with the right software, you can use a regular desktop or laptop computer and type up the Chinese language, just again using the same keystrokes everybody else uses. And you cannot, I'd hate to see a computer that had 8,000 or 10,000 keystrokes, so you'd never find them. So they can type up their language on a computer using English keystrokes. But their language is ideographic. Now, of the civilizations that we've studied, the Chinese is the only one that survived up until the 20th century. That is, see, well, you might ask, what about the Egyptian? Well, Egyptian civilization changed from the polytheism to Christianity, then from Christianity to Islam. You can't say its civilization survived. It was overrun. But the Chinese civilization survived intact until the 20th century. Then in the mid-19, and the year was 1949. In 1949, China was overrun by the communists, and for all practical purposes, old Chinese civilization came to an end at that point. All right. Back to their dynasties. Again, at this point, I don't want you to really memorize the names of the dynasties. Now, I will later. The Zhou dynasty was to last 900 years, and it's the longest to rule Chinese history to date. Here's the way the Chinese looked at their history of the dynasties. A dynasty would come on the scene when they had a powerful man who would take over from a weak dynasty. This powerful man would set up a dynasty that sometimes would last 200 years, sometimes 300. Eventually the dynasty would become weak and corrupt or get a bad ruler. Then the dynasty would be overthrown. Some strong man would overthrow it, and the cycle would repeat itself again. And this was to go on until 1905, when the last Chinese dynasty was overthrown. The republic was set up. But, During this time of the Zhou dynasty, the Chinese learned how to plow with iron. And this really was an advancement because at one time they were plowing using wooden plows, and the results were the wood would wear out pretty quickly. But iron was heavier and capable of going deeper into the soil, and Europeans had a superstition that iron would destroy the soil. It doesn't, but the Chinese were the first to use iron plows. And now this may sound obvious, but it wasn't. The Chinese were the first people to put a horse's harness on its shoulder instead of on its neck. Before this, the rest of the world was trying to get a horse to pull a plow or pull a load with a harness attached to its neck. And needless to say, the horse would have choked to death as it pulled. But then the Chinese got the brilliant idea, put the harness down on the horse's shoulder so the horse's shoulder is leaning into its load. And this enabled a horse to greatly pull a much stronger load and to plow a lot better than the horses had before. Now, your book talks about how the Chinese used natural fertilizers. And without making you, hopefully not, without making anybody sick, I must define that for you. Natural fertilizers meant they used human waste to fertilize the soil. Now, human waste does make the, as far as we know, the absolute best fertilizer for a garden. The problem is Westerners do not use it because it has the stigma attached to its human waste. The Chinese have used that method of fertilizing their gardens for millennia. Now, the Qin dynasty was the dynasty that built the Great Wall, and I pronounce it Qin. It's spelled Q-I-N. Q-I-N, the Qin dynasty. They built a Great Wall, which parts of which still stands. Also, the Qin's first emperor had a burial mound that we eventually found, and buried inside the burial mound were thousands of terracotta figures, each of them about 6 foot tall, and no two of them were alike. Now, these terracotta figures found their way to Atlanta and went to the Civic Center along with a whole lot of other historical artifacts. And I have to say, I did not go see them. In fact, the only display I ever went to see at the Civic Center was the Titanic. But anyway, the terracotta figures. Now, here's what the emperors believed, and this, again, this sounds a lot like Egyptian. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how much ancient China and Egypt sounds alike. But they believed instead of killing their soldiers, they would make statues of their soldiers and their servants and their prime minister and government officials, make statues of these people. And then when the emperor died, these statues would be buried with the emperor, and it was believed that these statues would serve the emperor like the real people served him while alive. Now, this is an improvement over some people. Some people believe that when the emperor died or their king died, the top servants were all to be killed to guarantee that the emperor would have servants to accommodate him into the next life. But at least the Chinese emperors were building statues of their people. In other words, like the Egyptians, the Chinese were preparing their king for a big afterlife. Now, the next dynasty, the Han. During the Han dynasty, paper was invented. You know, the Chinese, the Sumerians invented pretty a bunch. Let me stop. The Sumerians wove a bunch of reeds together and called that papyrus. The Egyptians also used papyrus, but real paper that's made from wood was another one of the inventions of the Chinese. But the Chinese invented paper, and under the Han Dynasty, the Chinese invented the rudder to guide their ships, and sails that had fore and aft rigging. You know, there was 2 sails rather than one big sail, and they also invented movable sails. What did the ancient Chinese eat? For the most part, from what we know, is mostly vegetarian, mostly simple, mostly what they grew in their gardens. They did not do a lot of hunting because the land was did not have any forests, not many forests to speak of. They had some. but the forests might be far away. So mostly it was a simple vegetarian diet. They were not herdspeople. They did not grow a lot of sheep or goats. Again, partly because from the beginning they were somewhat crowded. And China looks big on the map, folk. But most of China's people live in a small part of China, called China proper. The rest of the people of China are scattered on a very sparsely inhabited area, and so much of China is desert. All right. And this was something I was reminded of when I was still in high school. We had a man who was running for Congress come and talk to us. And he said that the problem with the Chinese, they had more people than we did, but their people were all bunched together in one small space. Unlike our people who were scattered in several populated areas. But anyway, from the beginning, the Chinese were trying to farm on a relatively very small farmland. And that made them seem crowded, but they actually were crowded because they were trying to live off of land, but most of it was not arable. And I ought to introduce you to that word, A-R-A-B-L-E. That means capable of farm, capable of being farmed. Only a small part of China is arable. The houses they lived in, what we know of, were simple and very sparsely furnished. They often slept on a cot on a floor. They didn't have anything that we might call a bed. And their furniture would double up as a bed and a sofa. They could roll up their cot and make like a sofa out of it. Oftentimes their houses consist of just one room. Their dress, very simple, very utilitarian, very practical. So basically what we might call a simple way of life. All right, religion. There have been many a historian who have said it looks like the original religion of mankind was monotheist, and originally the Chinese worshipped Shangdi. And that reminds us of the Indian Deus, or the Spanish Dios, or the English word deity, and maybe even the Greek theos. Tried to write that in Greek, folk. Anyway, no, I'm no expert in Greek, but I did learn that word when I was in college. But anyway, Shangdi, they were worshipped. But after a while, the worship of Shangdi fell in the background. Shangdi was looked on as being too impersonal and too distant to care for them. So they began to worship many, many gods, similar to the way the people of India did. And they broke away from the worship of one god to the worship of many. But as recently as 1935, the then president of China paid tribute to Shangdi, and the emperors down through the ages would pay tribute to Shangdi by going to his supposed dwelling place there in China and offering sacrifices to him and paying tribute to him. This went on for millennia. Now, they believed, and folk, this is one thing that separates them from Europe. They believed in the concept of heaven. Now, heaven was to them consists of the host of the spirit beings, and it was very impersonal. These spirit beings were not known by name. Right, when the emperor was set up, it was because heaven had decided to set up the emperor. And then if the emperor was overthrown, it was because heaven had rejected him. Heaven determined whether or not you lived a long time or a short time. Heaven determined who won the battle and who lost it. It was not in the case of like Westerners who had a personal God, namely Jesus, whom they knew by name. Heaven was a very impersonal, concept.
So was it kind of like divine right? Like everything was limited to divine right?
Divine rank?
Divine right.
Oh, divine right. Yeah, it's very similar. Very similar to the European concept of divine right, except in the case of the Europeans, they actually had a name for their God. In the case of the Chinese, it was just a very impersonal God. But actually, I haven't thought of it as being divine right. But, well, we'll get into that in a minute. They did have something that you might say was divine right. Now, They believed also that there were two primary opposite forces that made up the whole cosmos. These forces were the yang and the yin. The yang was the sun, moon. They believed that a person's body would function right if the yang and the yin were in the right balance. Now, folk, if you feel a little bit woozy and go to a doctor, the doctor might do a chemistry exam on you. Now, he won't call it yang and yin, but he might determine you have a low thyroid output. So he might give you thyroid medicine. But basically, he will try to get your body chemistry in balance. Now, of course, today's modern Western medicine is far more sophisticated than just two forces, yin and yang, that must be kept in balance. But there is some basis for this in science. You may know that magnetism consists of two poles, the north and the south. The north and the south will attract each other, put a north magnet to a north magnet, and they'll repel each other. Electricity consists of two forces, the positive and negative. Two positives repel each other. A positive will attract a negative. So both the positive and the negative must be in the circuit connected in order for you to have an electrical flow. So now, I'm not saying that two opposite forces make up the entire cosmos, but if any of you study physics, you may know that magnetism and electricity are a big part of the makeup of the universe. They're the forces, the electromagnetic force. There's a strong subatomic force, a weak subatomic force, and gravity. These forces make up part of the universe, but again, it's a little bit more complicated than or at least we think of as more complicated than the Chinese did. Now, the Chinese had another belief that came along with a belief in these two forces, a belief in fatalism. Fatalism. Fatalism simply says what will be, and there is nothing we can do about it. We will live as long as we do, and we're so totally helpless against the forces of heaven or against heaven. Heaven determines everything, and we can hardly know the will of heaven. And even if we do, we can't do anything to stop it. Now, this fatalism was to find its way into Greek literature also, which we'll talk about when we come to the chapter on Greece. And even in Christian circles, Christians who believe in predestination often have this idea that's very fatalistic. In other words, if I go into battle, if God wills it, I'm going to survive. If God doesn't will it, I'm not going to, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's completely out of my hands anyway. And folks, sometimes this is true. And sometimes it may not be. Again, each of you have to decide for yourself what you believe about these things. But the belief in the inevitability of our existence. What is going to be, let it be. Now, they developed the concept of the Da, or the way. In other words, this word is sometimes pronounced, spelled with a T, but I think more recently they're now pronouncing it with a Da, as Da. They believed that each individual to some extent had his own Da. In other words, what might be right for one person might be wrong for another, because that's just this person's Da. And I can hear my mother almost now saying, well, maybe that's just their way, that they don't mean any harm by it, that's just the way they live. But the most accurate English translation of this word is way. Now, the Chinese eventually developed a religion called Taoism, which had to do with everybody having his own Da or his own way. They also believed that when a person died, you had to perform necessary rituals. Otherwise, these relatives would come back to you as haunting ghosts. But the rituals were designed to encourage the dead to go into the next world or into the spirit world and not remain behind to come and haunt you in the middle of the night or to come and haunt you or just all of a sudden pop out of the shadows on you. But to keep this from happening, you had to perform rituals that would send your dead relatives on to the next life. All right, move on. Confucius. Among the Chinese philosophers, and I'm no expert on, but the ones I've studied, almost every one of them was rejected during his lifetime. And in a lot of cases, they were even killed during their lifetime. But they were not honored until long after they were gone. Confucius was not killed during his lifetime, but he was not accepted until long after he left, long after he died. And in those days, the philosopher had to get some wealthy person to sponsor him. Basically, had to get a job, and Confucius never did find anyone to actually sponsor him. Well, I won't go into many details about Confucius' personal life. He just simply did not seemingly amount to much while he was alive, his personal life. But he developed a philosopher that everybody had his own Da or his own way. In other words, you should not condemn another person who acts different from you, because maybe that's their Da, and then you have your own Da, they have theirs, so let the other person be the other person. Folks, I'm not trying to say that this is right. Under certain conditions, perhaps it is, and under other conditions, there's some rules of life that actually we all have to abide by. But now, he believed that if you could get yourself in harmony with the universe, you would prosper. The idea was you figured out which way the drift was going, which way the tide was flowing, which way, and just sort of more or less drift along with the tide. And if you let the tide carry you where the tide would, then you would prosper. I should, but I can't go wrong with that myself. But anyway, but I mean, again, it's his way of thinking. There are times when you should go strong against the tide, because the tide is going to lead you to the rocks, folk. I mean, but that's another. Anyway, the real aspects, the practical. What was important was the practical. Real. He believed in compassion, something that the Indian religions lacked. He believed that the government depends on the will of the people. Now, Thomas Jefferson will like that, our founding father in this country, that as long as the government does what the people want it to, it will prosper, it will do well, and when the government goes against the will of the people, it will not prosper. Again, you can decide for yourself. He believed that people should be appointed to government positions based on their ability, not their noble birth. And again, this was something the Chinese were far ahead of Europeans on. The Russian Tsar Peter the Great believed the same thing, that forget about being firstborn of high birth. If a younger son had more ability than the older one, the younger son should get the job and the older one should be bypassed. But you promote a person based on ability, not on where they were born to, whether their father was if your father was a general, that meant you would be a general. Well, Confucius said, no, you only became a general if you proved that you were capable of leading an army. The Chinese would often say to each other in the conversations, Confucius say. In other words, what Confucius said was almost like gospel truth. Well, as was the case of all these philosophers, after Confucius died, he was elevated to a lofty status. The same thing can be said for Socrates. The same thing can be said, Socrates was not honored until after he died. To some extent, the same thing can be said for Moses, for Jesus, for a lot of others. They were not really elevated till after they were gone. But anyway, Confucius developed a few followers. Among them, one of the main ones was Mencius, M-E-N-C-I-U-S. Taught that man was basically good. So it was up to government then to let people alone. If the government could win the hearts of the people, then the people would cooperate and would behave, and there'd be harmony and order. But it was up to the government to actually, you might say, charm the people into doing right. Man was basically good. Give the people what they like, and all will go well. So, again, folks, every one of these philosophies has some kind of merit, and every one of them has some serious weakness. And the Chinese have a saying that every idea, no matter how absurd, has been uttered by some philosopher at one time or another. Well, not everybody agreed with Mencius. The people were basically good, so up comes another philosophy called legalism. Legalism said that man is basically evil. And it's up to the government to hold man's evil in check, to catch the evildoers, to bring the evildoers to justice, to punish the evildoers, that the government must be firm and hard, and only by firm action could the state bring about order. And you should follow your religion, but follow it to the extreme letter of the law. And as they should, again, the same rules to suppose you would apply from one generation to another. Now, I will say this about legalism. Folk, on a very personal note, I grew up in a legalistic environment. I have abandoned that teaching because I think it did me and some of my brothers and sisters, particularly my brothers, a whole lot more harm than it did good. Under legalism, you're always under condemnation, judgment, condemnation. And, all right, on a personal note, my mother died 9 days ago. I went to Ohio for a funeral, and one of my sisters spoke up about my mother. Everything was either too long, or too short, or too tight, or too loose. Nothing was ever just right. And my sister talked about the clothing she wore. But you were always under judgment or condemnation. I got a little bit of money one time and spent it on a gadget that I wanted, and my dad condemned me for spending my money foolishly. You need to be saving it for this. Everything you did was wrong. There was always something better. I mean, that's legalism, or that you make the laws so strict that nobody can abide by them. But worse than that, in a legalistic environment, each person is keeping a different set of rules. Again, back to Taoism. So you might condemn this person for doing something that you yourself don't do, but in turn they're condemning you for doing, because you're doing something that they don't believe in. And each person is keeping a different set of rules and judging and condemning them. Now, does any of you know what I'm talking about? Well, maybe you haven't experienced what I have. I don't see. Well, I see at least one head nodding. Hopefully, maybe you won't, but sooner or later, you'll run into this type of environment where people are always at each other's throats, judging each other, condemning each other, making up new rules to try to trap you in the new rules. This is wrong, that's wrong, in fact, everything is wrong. It's wrong to take aspirin, it's wrong to have a television in your home, and some of these things actually do have merit. It's wrong to play cards, and I'll tell you something about card playing. It can become addictive and habit forming, but it doesn't have to. But every form of entertainment, every form of pleasure is wrong. All right. And again, legalistic people, you have a hard time getting along with them. All right, now this comes another philosophy, Taoism. Now here is a problem with Confucius. We are not even sure, like Buddha, if Confucius even believed that there's a God. His religion has sometimes been called a philosophy more than a religion, and it had a serious defect. If a Chinese mother lost her infant child to a disease, Confucianism offered no solace or no comfort. Not the feeling that, well, you're going to see that child again, or that child is in a better place. Nothing like that. It's just that child is gone, and it's gone forever, and you'll never see it again. I mean, no comfort for the bereaved. And also, what was lacking was anything that had much of anything to do with spirituality. It was all the here and now, this life, without explaining, well, what happens to the dead. Well, into this scenario stepped Taoism. Taoism teaches, among other things, that you can have a long, long life if you have proper meditation, proper diet, and proper sexual technique. Now, again, this is on a personal note. I used to receive mail. I haven't received any in years, but before I was married, 35 years ago, I received mail. They were trying to recruit me into Taoism. The Taoists were actively trying to recruit Westerners, most notably Western men, into their religion. And they would tell about this monastery in Tibet where all the men looked like they're in their 20s, but they were 130 years old. Well, I asked a Chinese man about it. He said, yeah, but you never can document when these men were born. You never can actually prove who these men are. But they will claim that these men are 120, 130 years old, and they look like they're 20 years old. But you cannot actually prove that they're as old as they claim. But they would say that you can live this long and still look like you're 20 when you're over 100 if you follow our proper exercise, proper meditation, proper diet. It claims it's a science. However, hardly any Westerner would call it a science. It is oftentimes associated with magic. Now, people who like an individualized approach to life, in other words, I can live life my own, according to my own law, my own way. If that's my way, who's to sin against it? These kind of people are attracted to Taoism. It has been said that the founder of Taoism and Confucius met one time, and the two men simply could not understand each other. Then the founder of Taoism went on his way and was never seen again, but his papers were left behind, and from there his followers grabbed up his papers and made a religion of it. As to what happened to the original founder, we don't know. And Confucius then went on to found his own religion. Again, for most Chinese religions, necessity overruled spirituality. The practical overruled the spiritual. This life overruled the next. And as I already mentioned, none of these religions offer any assurance of a happy afterlife for its followers after death. And when we come to Christianity, this is one of the things that made Christianity very appealing, because it did offer that. But Confucius did not offer, neither for that matter did Taoism, offer much of a happy afterlife after death. The emperors now, they were looking forward to a happy afterlife. The ordinary people were not. The emperors believed that if they could bury themselves in graves where the carved soldiers protected them, went with them to the next world, that this would lead them to a happy afterlife. But for the most common people, there was little to look forward to in the hereafter. All right. Now, we're about to end chapter 3 here, but there's a few things we want to sum up about what all these civilizations. Now, up until last year, folk, I was teaching chapters 1, 2, and 3 and giving a test over them all at once. So what I'm saying here applies to what we said in chapter 1. What did all these civilizations we talked about, India, China, Sumer, Babylon, Persia, what did they all have in common? So much was dependent on the ability of the ruler. You followed the man. Now, I want to tell you something. When I was in the Army, they told us, when you see an officer, you salute. No, you don't salute the officer. You don't salute the man. You salute the rank he has. You salute the bars he's wearing. You salute the maple leaf he's wearing, or even the stars. You don't salute the man. The man who's wearing them might appear to you to be a louse or whatever, and might actually be a louse. But nevertheless, he has the office. You salute that. What matters is the office he holds, not the man. But in the ancient world, what mattered was the man and how much charisma he had. And you followed him if he was capable of leading, and if he wasn't, you did not follow him. You did not work for him. But again, we believe that we respect a man in office because of the office he holds, not because of the man he is. Therefore, we believe we should respect our president, even though half of us at any time will wish he were not in office. And I'm speaking of all the presidents. Every one of them during my lifetime, and I've gone through about 10 of them. Every one of them been highly, severely criticized for something or another that they did, and maybe some of the criticism was deserved. Again, power was based on a person's ability to hold it, not on the office he held. For the most part, they did not have a document we call a constitution. Now, when we come to Greece, we're going to find out the Greeks, a lot of the Greek city-states, wrote up a constitution, and you followed the constitution. In our country, our real ruler is not our president, not our Congress, but our constitution. We wrote the Constitution up more than 200 years ago, and with a few amendments, we follow it. The Constitution is like our guide and our boss, not a ruler. Now, in those days, when a king took over, he'd immediately decide which laws he wanted to keep, which laws he didn't. When our government takes over, they can change laws, but basically they have to obey the laws that have already been written. So the government has a continuity. And the continuity that was lacking in the time we're talking about. A new king taking over meant a period of upheaval, instability. Nobody knew what was what. Nobody knew what the new king was going to do. Democracy among the ancients, the first 3 chapters was unknown. No constitution, no democracy. Unlike the Greeks, now we're going to be talking of next time, after Monday's test, next Wednesday, about the Greeks, and they experimented with democracy. The Romans had a democracy, and the Romans also had a constitution. The Greeks, some of their city-states did. A ruler would depend heavily on his advisors and on his governors. He appeared to be absolute authority, but they could never have the authority Hitler had unless it was over one city-state, because by the time Hitler came along, he had telephones, he had airplanes, he had trains, he had trucks, automobiles, and he could control Germany from a central location. But before the invention of the telephone and the automobile and the superhighway, kings of large countries had to depend on their governors. So he would appoint a governor or a duke or say, or a count, you go here, you go there, and report to me every once in a while. But now, having said that, folks, I want to remind you, with today's technology and the aid of a computer, one man could rule a country without deputies, without advisors, and have the type of authority that even Adolf Hitler would never have dreamed of being able to hold. Could determine, whether or not you were allowed to give your children allowance, and if you decided you wanted something, a computer could say, hey, you can't afford this, you can't have it. Or you have to buy this, you have to buy that. The type of authority that not even Adolf Hitler would have. Today, a dictator, thanks to our computers, could develop more authority that would actually choke all the liberties out of us. These civilizations would come, rise for a while, and then fade. Where was the Sumerian civilization? Disappeared from history. The Hittites disappeared and lost to history. The Akkadians, most of you probably never heard of them, disappeared and lost to history. Persia is still around as Iran. Egypt is around, but even they underwent serious changes until they're not the same as they once were. Oftentimes, these civilizations would start out as a nomadic people, riding horses from one place to another. They would come in contact with a more advanced civilization. They eventually would, hey, we outnumber them. They'd overthrow the more advanced civilization. They'd become somewhat civilized themselves, adopt the culture of the people they conquered. Then they would be conquered by other nomadic neighbors, even as they had conquered others. The Amorites started out in Arabia as nomadic herdsmen, went and conquered Sumer. And they themselves were conquered by Babylon. These people were extremely religious. As far as we know, you have no religious skeptics among them. Now, this was not true of the Greeks. The Greeks had persons who we might call atheists, agnostic. Among the ancient Near Eastern peoples, they seem to have had none of this. However, their gods tended to change. They'd have a god who would appear for a while, and then he'd take a back seat in the pantheon, and a new god would come to the forefront. But the validity of their religions never appears to have been doubted. Their religion oftentimes was intertwined with magic, superstition, shamanism, temple prostitution, and sacrifice, and even the sacrifices often included human sacrifice, particularly the sacrifice of babies. I mean, their young women would go to the temple to practice prostitution to honor their goddess, oftentimes Inanna or Venus or Aphrodite or Semiramis or Isis. And the babies they would have as a result of this prostitution, they would offer as a sacrifice on their altars. Magic, the belief that if I do certain rituals, the gods have to, you know, basically the belief that I'm in charge and the gods are my servant. And if I perform the right kind of rituals, the gods have to honor me. You know, if I carry around a rabbit's foot, the gods have to bring me good fortune. If I find a 4-leaf clover, the gods have to bring me good fortune because, you know, basically I'm in charge and the gods are my servant. And I once read that magic was probably the worst form of religion that man had ever thought of because it puts the human in charge and the gods as slaves. Shamanism, a belief that certain people can use a drug to go in a trance, and then in a trance they visit the spirit world, and then whatever answer they get from the spirits, they wake up and come back and tell what they saw in the spirit world. Shamanism is a widespread practice among the primitive people, and shamanism is usually associated with primitive peoples, and some people believe that it helps keep people primitive. Just like animism. Animism is also often associated. Animism is a worship of nature. Nature is God. The tree is God. The river is God. Everything is God. The goal of the religions was not a happy afterlife, but they all had this in common. The goal was to conquer, get gain, build yourself up. If I have more than you, then that means I'm leading a better life than you. But in the case of some cases, it was you let go. Like in the case of Buddhism, the more you let go of, if I have fewer desires than you, then I'll be happier than you are. Or I'll experience less sorrow than you. There was little promised among these religions who have a good afterlife. Now, some would say India was an exception, but even in the case of India, you had to go through millennia of cycles to eventually attain the happy afterlife. And even until the New Testament times, even Jewish people placed little emphasis on the afterlife until shortly before the time of Christ. Women were relegated to inferior roles, secondary roles, stay at home, don't get involved in government, don't become politically active. They oftentimes had to follow stricter rules than the men did. These societies were also slave societies. All of them had a lot of slaves. Their art, their music was generally religious in nature. And much of their life centered around the temples which existed in every city, and the temples were usually very magnificent. The city, most people either lived in a city or in a countryside near one, at least most civilized people. Your uncivilized people would be nomadic herdsmen, but your civilized people either lived in a city or close to one. Now, in preparation for Monday's test, I want to make sure that I've covered oh yes, something I must mention. Oh, the Silk Road. All right, we'll talk more about the Silk Road later. Hey, I went through history courses in high school and college. I was not even aware the Silk Road existed, but now your books are emphasizing it. The Silk Road basically joined China to the Mediterranean world. And very important. Now, the Silk Road, the route changed from generation to generation, time to time. The route changed as political conditions changed, as they tried to avoid robbers and thieves along the way. But essentially, goods like most notably silk would start out in China, and in general now, in fact, as far as we know, no Chinese person ever got to the Mediterranean. Instead, a Chinese person would start the shipment of the goods. He'd sell it to the next merchant 100 or so miles away. Then the next merchant would sell it to the next. But the merchandise eventually got to the Mediterranean. And But again, the shippers who started out never got there. In the same way when it went reverse, when Mediterranean products were sent to China, as far as we know, no European ever went as far as China. I mean, that was a very, very long overland trip, very dangerous. Silk Road, the road that joined the Mediterranean to the Western world. Now, oh yes, a belief that you can get to this is India more than it is China. You can achieve high, lofty thoughts by depriving yourself. Asceticism has to do with fasting. I may have gone over that word. Fasting, sometimes walking on a bed of hot coals or lying on a bed of spikes, creating a lot of pain to yourself. This is believed to get a person very high up in the spirit world. All right, if I ask you, and I don't know if you'll get this question or not, but it is on the test. Name 3 things Confucius taught. He taught everyone had his own doll. He taught the practical aspects of living. One thing conspicuous he did not teach us much about any kind of, well, he did not teach about a happy afterlife at all. It was all the here and now. That the government, if it pleased the people, everybody be happy. That the government was set up by the will of the people and held and stayed together by the will of the people. Again, I would like you to be able to name 3 things that Buddha taught. Buddha taught if you got the right meditation, the right occupation, the right thinking, 8 rights, you would be happy. He also taught that you should get rid of all desire, because desire was what led to misery and evil. When desire did, when you lost your material things. So if you had no love for anybody or anything, you'd never lose. No matter what befell you, you'd always be happy. Things like that. All right. What's the difference between Brahman and Nirvana? They're both essentially, they both have to do with India, they both have to do with ultimate reality. One of them is for Hindu and one of them is for Buddha. Brahman, what's that? Nirvana, Buddha, Hinduism, Brahman. Did y'all get, yes?
The Brahmin, they were priests, weren't
Yeah, there was a caste of priests called a Brahmin. In other words, it's like the same word, 2 different meanings. We have a lot of that in English language. Brahmin was a priestly caste, but also an ultimate state of existence for these people. It was what they were looking for to eventually achieve. Now, the hardest question on a test, I don't know, again, if you'll get this one, something I just went over. 5 things that all these civilizations had in common. Much depended on one man. They did not have a constitution, did not have any religious skeptics among them. They did not have a democracy. They were very religious. Yes. The 5 things that all these civilizations had in common. We come to the Greeks and we're going to find that they had a constitution, they had democracy, they had religious skeptics, they had debates among themselves about what was the best philosophy. I mean, I'm not saying the others didn't have it, not to the extent the Greeks did. That, and again, I don't know if you'll get that one, and that is one though that's really gets a lot of persons somewhat riled. Now, the test format will be the same. Oh yes, yes, I must mention, I almost forgot it. The pass is also on Monday. Now, I went over the pass with you, did I not? It's a map, a world map. We identify 18 things. Is that not right? I did not? Oh my, all right, then I'll tell you what. Go over it now. All right, let me show you now, folks. The pass. All right, let me give you about a couple of minutes here, and I'll show you what the pass will look like. I'm so glad that I thought of this. All right, now, pass. It's going to look like, all right here. Then I'll go over the 18 things you need to know. But, folks, when you see it, I mean, hey, I don't care what you see. It's going to look like this, a blank world map. Down at the bottom will be 18 places identified. Just simply a blank world map. Yes? I'm going to put it on the board. The 18 places. I mean, basically, that's it. Just simply, I'll hand out a blank world map. Now, the 18 names you need to know. Here goes. And I do have time to put them down. All right. North America. Italy. These are places we either have visited or will visit before the semester's out. And again, I guess I simply overlooked it with you, but hey, there's time. We have 5 days. North America, Italy, Greece, India, China. Greece, India, China, South America, Arabia, Israel. Africa, Rome, Arabia. I do? All right. All right, that's okay. England. I need to do a marker. Let's see. Germany, Russia. Let's see, 2 more. Vietnam. Scandinavia. Now, you might not can read that, but anyway. Now, what I want you to do, folks, now I don't think that you can write in Australia down here, even if it's the proper place. I won't give you credit for it. We don't talk about Australia this semester, but I want you to be able to just simply, man, don't put down the numbers either. Don't say, can I put down number 1, number 2? No, please don't. It makes it harder on me to grade. Write in North America, in the place where North America belongs. Now, this seems to me to be really easy, but I'm surprised that many college students simply cannot do this. Yes?
Is it going to be like there are numbers inside?
The numbers are there. I mean, but the numbers are just simply, I want you to write not the numbers down, but the place. Right? In other words, write North America where North America belongs. It's easier on me to grade.
Is it going to be a format on the computer that we can type it in, or will it
No, you just simply write it in with pencil. It's going to look like this. This is the actual test. It's going to look just like this. I mean, a blank world map, and you just simply write in with a pencil.